Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about health and illness in the Black or African American population. Again, as I've said with all of these categories, even the book cannot make a real decision as to how it wants to refer to different groups of people because there's so many different words, so many different terminology that can be applied to race and ethnicity that all the categories are kind of confusing and kind of blended. And again, I challenge you all to take a look at the US Census coding of races, and the book covers this in each chapter. But again, what you're going to find is the way we code race doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. Does it actually make sense that someone from India is considered Asian? Does it make sense to call someone who's black in America the same race as someone who's in Africa? Okay, how do the genetics support this? So we need to be asking a lot of questions. What's the proper term? Because throughout history, there's been a lot of proper terms for being African American. This idea of African American or the idea of Hispanic, as we're going to talk about next time, these are recent social constructions, new labels and new categories that we've created. So we need to be asking a lot of questions about race. So when it comes to race, the first thing we're going to realize is race, albeit socially constructed, and albeit there is no biological basis for race, and the categories don't make any sense at all. Despite all of that, the experience of race, the experience of ethnicity is incredibly real. So, again, for someone to stand up here and say that you don't actually have a race, well, that's what the book says. The book is saying that all of these categories we use are actually just pan ethnicities. And so our idea of race is completely false. And even the medical community is suggesting that we no longer control for race because it doesn't make sense in our studies. But despite any doubts we have whether or not races are real categories or whether or not they accurately biologically group people together, the experience of race is very real. And we can look at this from several ways, but specifically access. What's the association between race and access? Your ability to rise up the social class ladder, to position yourself in a higher social location. And then what's the association between race and behavior, attitudes, culture, our general way of life? Because our race is a major factor in who we marry and who our friends are, our perceptions about life, and then for this class, our perceptions toward health and illness, for example. Okay, so we've been talking about this for a few weeks, but the idea is we have to kind of understand, where does race come from? What's the origin of it? How does it affect people's lives in modern times? Do the categories make any sense? Do we need new categories to accurately group people based upon biological categories? How many categories would we actually need if we were to kind of rewrite the book on race and really get into the medical side and kind of determine which groups of people actually share common genes? And when we do that, we find incredible things like people from Norway all the way to Africa share common resistance to malaria. They share common genetics from Africa to malaria. So is that a race? Same thing with things like lactose intolerance, for example. That's also influenced by genetics. And groups of people like in Western Europe can, in North Africa can have milk, and other places they can't, for example. So these, how do we group people together according to genetics is, beyond the scope of this class, but it's still something we need to be thinking about. So again, in order to understand race, we have to look at it from a biopsychosocial approach. Do all black people share common genetics? And the answer is no, absolutely not. And it's a falsehood. Yes, there are some groups within the black community that do, share some common genetics, and but that goes for all races, okay? But it's not the way it works that all white people have the same genes that are totally different than all black people, because again, we're all blended, and it goes back, 100,000 years to Africa, and then everyone mixing and mixing and mixing, and genetics are a little different. They don't really work the way we might think they do. Okay. So again, is black or African American, is that actually a race? And the answer is no. It's again an ethnicity. It's people from the United States and Canada, and it's people from Latin America, and it's people from the Caribbean, and it's people from Africa. Okay. And then as you can kind of see, and you have those border groups, that everything just kind of blends and mixes a little bit. Okay. So again, even being black is not a race, it's an ethnicity. I mean, white's not a race, it's an ethnicity. It's a grouping of people from all around the world. Same with Asian, half the planet's Asian. So again, just things to be thinking about. Okay? To understand the experience, though, of African Americans, we have to kind of delve back into colonialism. Again, Europe conquered the Americas along with much of the world. England was our main conqueror here in the United States, Spain in the Latin America, France and England and Canada. Okay? So, the goal of Europeans was to divide society into rich and poor so that Europeans could maintain upper class positions. Okay? Now, they subjugated all people of all races that were not European, okay, into the lower classes, into the lower class workforce, and then denied them access to take elite social positions. Okay, so only Europeans for hundreds of years were able to gain access to rise up the social class ladder and take elite social positions. African Americans originally came to the United States not as slaves, but by early as 1619, we start bringing slaves to the Americas. Okay, there was already an established slave trade in Africa, and so Europeans basically came in, made that big business, and 5 million slaves were brought over to the United States by 1860. Okay, so African Americans, when they came here, were stuck in the lower class workforce as slaves and at best indentured servants. Okay, since then, we had a lot of social movements, including the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. And in modern times, you're still seeing that struggle continue. So, the struggle for equity between whites and non whites is something that all people of all races in the United States have faced, okay? All non-whites. They've been fighting this from, the Asians in New York City and in California to African Americans in the South to Native Americans continuing their protests. This has been going on for a long time, this racial conflict in the United States. It's not old news. But again, the racial conflict comes down to Europeans created racial categories so they could very clearly define who gets to be in the upper class and who gets to be in the lower class. And then they imposed rules, regulations, and social norms to subjugate entire people into the lower class workforce. And for hundreds of years, they did everything they could to keep any of minority groups down, including women and races other than whites. Okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act, slavery, denying Jewish people access. It goes back way deep. Okay, so again, the African American experience is definitely an experience of prejudice and discrimination and denying of access and equity opportunity, the ability to have the American dream simply because of the color of their skin. Okay. So if we could deconstruct race and no longer use words like white and black and Asian, and if we could, I mean, you could use Asian for culture, but not as a race. Or we could at least change the meanings attached to race, then we have a chance at ending racism and reducing prejudice and discrimination to nothing. Okay. But being black means facing the minority experience, okay? And this goes for all minority groups, women, Native Americans, Asians, they all, being gay, you have to experience the stigmatization attached to this because of the culture that we live in, because the culture of America was historically racist and sexist and heteronormative, okay? There's very prejudicial toward non-whites and women and non-heterosexuals, for example. So these are all forms of stratification, the ways we divide into groups. Your membership in a group is associated with your status, okay? And so your membership in a group is associated with your status, which gets you or denies you access. It's also associated with your way of life, your behavior, your attitudes, your thoughts and your ideologies, etc. Okay, so currently in the United States, there's 13.2% African American, 44.5 million people that identify as African American. Okay, but again, what is the politically correct word? And should we stop using racial words altogether? Because look, if you're in Africa, being black in many places, that's a swear word. You should never refer to someone as black because they don't appreciate that. To them, that's like a slur. That's like a bad thing to say to somebody. But in America, being black is something you're proud of. So again, there's a huge disparity between what people want to be called and what they don't want to be called. And next time we're going to talk about Mexicans not wanting to be called Hispanics because again, Mexicans want to be called Mexicans. So again, you have to be asking some questions. The Latinos, do they all identify as Mexican or as Hispanic or etc. You need to be asking questions, okay? So, you know, And then go even further. Does being black for someone in the United States differ than the experience of someone who's from Africa living in the United States? Okay. So you have somebody who's born here and somebody who came here as an immigrant, and do they have completely different understandings of race and experience? You have to ask some pretty bold questions to really delve into the subjective cultural experiences of people and where they're coming from, because this affects our daily lives and our culture, and then essentially for y'all, your approach to how you deal with clients. So again, class location is a common theme you're seeing throughout this book. Minorities historically were subjugated in poverty. So if you want to account for why Native Americans are at risk more than other racial groups, for example, almost across the board, again, what's the first thing you point to? Cultural imperialism and poverty. And it's the same thing for all minority groups. The experience of poverty, lower social class location, is associated with higher risk factors and lower access to healthcare, for example. So people in poverty, they might not be able to afford the cancer drugs, whereas somebody who's rich can afford the cancer drugs. Therefore, the person in poverty, they died, and then the rich person, they got to live. And again, the disparity between life and death in that kind of a situation, again, is where are you located in the social class system? If you look at something simple like the Titanic, the rich survived and the poor died. Why? And again, it's because of social class location. Just silly things, but things you need to be thinking about and asking a lot of questions. Okay, so African Americans are located in all the socioeconomic groups. However, when you do it proportionally, you find that African Americans have higher rates of poverty than other races. Okay, so 50% of African Americans are living in poverty. And again, you have to ask why. And how much of that is because of America and racist ideologies, prejudice, and discrimination? An African American, it would have been very difficult to even get capital until the 1960s. Very difficult. The biggest disparity between whites and blacks is home ownership when it comes to wealth. So, again, if we can help someone who's black buy a house, that will level the playing field. But again, because of prejudice and discrimination in mortgages and all the other requirements and ways and forms of institutional exclusion, you see a big disparity there. Okay, so African Americans are concentrated in high areas with rent, crowded and inadequate housing, where you're going to find higher rates of crime, poorer neighborhoods, increased violence and drugs. Again, all of this affects our resilience, physical and mental resilience to be able to cope with the environment. So again, the effects of poverty is something you need to see. But why are people in poverty? Well, a lot of it has to do with prejudice and discrimination. Okay, some poverty is good because it motivates people to rise up and it creates incentive, but only a little bit. Not when you have like entire groups of people in poverty. That's not motivating people, that's just keeping entire groups down. That's institutional discrimination. Okay, and so we've historically discriminated against minorities and stuck them in the lower classes and never gave them a chance to get out. Never gave them a chance to get that good education, to get that good job with prestige, to get that wealth, to get some power over their lives and other people, to increase their life chances. Again, your status, your race, your sex, compounded with your education, job, prestige, and wealth, along with religion and sexual orientation and numerous other factors, these are all associated with your social class location, where you're located compared to other people. And in the United States, we subjugated African Americans and all other minorities into the lower classes, which affect their life chances, their access, and especially their access to healthcare. So, again, originally African Americans did not come over as slaves, but by 1619, you saw them being enslaved. Okay, the stories are dark. We're not going to go too deep into it again in this class because we're, again, more focused on the medical side, but please take some time, study the experiences. Um, the African culture that was brought here was incredibly rich, but as soon as people came over, they took away their original names. They gave them white sounding names. They destroyed their culture and imposed European culture and Christianity upon them. Okay? So their, historical gods, religions, rites, rituals, their culture, their common way of life was destroyed upon coming to the United States. And then they were taught English by white Southerners. And hence, a Southern way of life is often associated with an African American culture because, again, where did they first learn their language? From a Southern way of speaking, a Southern way of life, for example. Pre-Civil War versus post-Civil War. So pre-Civil War again, slaves, slavery ends. They weren't slaves in the North again, just in the South. But the North would support them coming and retrieving slaves and bringing it back. So again, it wasn't pretty. After the Civil War, we started out a great period of Reconstruction, but then this was then countered by white supremacy and fear and segregation and more prejudice and discrimination, which kind of ended Reconstruction. And a time of Jim Crow came into be, where you'd have these unsaid kind of covert policies, ways of restricting people based upon their race, sex, social class, etc. But Jim Crow specifically was race. And then you have the civil rights movements starting in the 1950s and 1960s, which is just a growing movement that had been, a lot of people have been chipping away at this for a long time. Whites, too, guys. Whites, Supreme Court, 1940s, whites were fighting for rights. So again, it's not just African Americans. You had incredible white people, all these lawyers jumping in, trying to make things better. It took a while. It took to the 1960s to really get a lot of that into place, but again, it was a lot of people want this. Okay, America, albeit had a lot of racist ideology, but at some point, something had to give because of liberty and justice for all. It's it's built into America. Whatever, okay? So after the Civil War, then to the Civil Rights Movement, things got better, and then now you're still seeing these movements because there is still prejudice and discrimination. Okay, and you can see this in pay rates. Why does an African American make, a woman make 40 cents less than a white man, and why does an African American woman make 20 cents less than a white woman? So again, all women are discriminated against and paid less, but then an African American lady or Hispanic lady is paid even less than a white woman. And again, that shows you intersectional layers of, race and sex and social class and all of this operates. Okay. So again, the Supreme Court was a friend to minorities and always has been. Okay. So Supreme Court passing things like same-sex marriage laws and civil rights acts and upholding these things. Okay. And instituting the schools and, integrating the schools. This is the Supreme Court. So a lot of people have been fighting this, even though there's been some countersuit. So it's really great that we live in a time where it's getting a lot better, but there's still a lot more room to grow. That's why we're talking about this, okay? So a lot of the traditional African methods, again, were stripped away. So you have to realize that this culture of theirs, this heritage, their heritage chain was removed. They were cut off, it was severed. And they were imposed upon a cultural imperialism of European English culture and English way of life. Okay, but they were also brought into society as subjugated people with no access. So again, how did this affect their attitudes? Again, what does a African American have in common with someone from Africa? It's a question you got to ask. What does a white woman have in common with a black woman? Does a white woman experience being a woman the same way a black woman experiences being a woman? Do they have different experiences because of that intersectional layer of race and sexism? Things to be asking questions about. Okay, so again, but the book does cover some of these attitudes that have upheld, okay, the test of time and are being reintroduced as you see more immigration from Africa. Okay, health and life are the same. Okay, the idea is this balance again between living and the dead. Okay, your deeds influence your destiny. So again, a lot of action and you having control of your life is built into this. As with all cultures, you see this balance of harmony versus disharmony, of yin versus yang, good versus evil, positive versus negative. So somewhere in the equilibrium of all things that is almost universal across human cultures are these philosophies of that balance. But again, how do we approach that balance? That mind, body, and spirit interconnectedness. And then that's the idea that we're opening ourselves up to, because again, in science, it tends to close you to the idea of spirituality because you can't test it, you can't prove it. But again, this has been a part of humanity for so long that as medical professionals, for example, we have to treat the whole person. We have to see where they're coming from. And if that's what works for them, we have to open up our minds to that. Okay? The idea of disharmony coming from spirits, demons, magic. I mean, you have to say what you will. But this is something that goes back millennia in human history. Okay? This is just something people have always believed in. And in modern times, we want to critique this. But again, can't prove it, can't disprove it is also an interesting way to view life. Okay? Yes, culturally they had great knowledge of herbs, roots, things to treat illnesses. They were experimenting with immunization, such as using cowpox as the immunization against smallpox and rubbing it on the arms of children, for example. So again, you can see a lot of human history. We've been looking to nature to find solutions to our problems, such as disease. We've also been looking to the spirit realm to answer some questions there, if the spirit realm exists. Okay, so you can see that we're looking and trying to use all the tools at our disposal, and these are common across human cultures, okay, pre-industrial times. The elderly are held in high esteem. The idea that the community taking care of all the age groups is very important. Death is seen as passing from one stage to another. It is also seen as joyous. And I found it really interesting the book talking about how they would pass the children over the dead body, hoping that the problems and with the children would then pass through and then go be taken away and taken to the other world. I thought that was really interesting anthropologically. Okay, so Africans, the book talks about it with Africans and African Americans. Health is maintained with proper diet, eating 3 nutritious meals a day, eating a hot breakfast, getting rest in a clean environment is also important. Using laxatives to keep the system open and running, to restore using sugar and turpentine to get rid of worms, poultices to fight infection, herbs and herbal teas for various issues. They use asafoetida, worn around the neck, prevents contagious disease. And you see that in a lot of cultures, wearing something, an amulet or an herb or things like that around the neck. Cod liver oil to prevent cold, sulfur and molasses to prevent illness in the spring. Bangles, they're the bracelets. The book has pictures of all of this. That was really cool, a lot of the pictures in there. Copper or silver to warn, to protect against harm. Again, we're looking to nature, and we're looking to the spirituality world, to really deal with health and illness and be able to cope with it. And the book has lots of great herbal remedies: camphor oil for congestion, lemon water and honey for colds, poultices for inflammation, salt pork to treat cuts and wounds. So that's some really fun stuff. Make sure you guys look through that in the book. But again, prayer is the most common. Goes back millennia. Okay, so religion and humanity, being tied with the earth and the spirit world, this goes back all culturally for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, rooting the idea of voodoo, again, prescribing treatment, the delving into magic rituals and folk medicine. The voodoo healers are people that heal. You also have to respect the ideological differences when it comes to religion. How does religion divide people? And then how is religion associated with culture and attitudes? Because again, you have Africans that identify as Christian, Africans that identify as Muslim, Africans with different types of religion. How does that influence your attitudes toward health and illness? How does that influence your diet, the things that you eat, for example? We need to be aware of this. The book talks about insulin being a pork product and Muslims not eating pork, person who's Jewish not eating pork. We need to be aware of these cultural inflections, okay? So again, turning to religion and spirits is just something you're going to see. It's a common thread throughout the entire book, okay? Current health problems, again, just poverty is the number one way to look at it, guys. When groups have higher rates of poverty, especially due to prejudice and discrimination, you're going to see the less access to healthcare and higher rates for most risk factors, with the exception of suicide with African Americans, which is another interesting side note. But mortality, all of the higher risk factors, heart rate, heart disease. It's just the book has a lot of great ones. I won't bore you with all the details again, but the effects of poverty. We've been trying to go through this over and over and over again because it just increases all the rates of everything. The book did talk about sickle cell anemia and how that does run in the genetics, and it got pretty deep into it. But again, you got to ask, is that something that all black people are at risk for, or is that just some groups? And then now we need to pinpoint which groups those are because that's a race. Okay. Again, I cannot personally speak about prejudice and discrimination personally as a result of, the ascribed status I have as a male who has been told my whole life I was white, even though I don't identify as white. Does that give me privilege? And which box do I check if I need a good job, for example? And there's a lot of questions you should be asking, like how does white privilege actually operate? So again, I needed to quote the book for this one because, The subjective experience of being black, how could I personally talk about that? It's like the subjective experience of being female. I don't know if it would be, if I could talk about that. I can share common themes from research and studying. But again, so this was quoted from the book, but this is the experience of blacks in the healthcare system. But again, this is the experience of prejudice and discrimination. Quoting it as a degrading and humiliating experience. Blacks fearing or resenting health clinics. When they get there, they might have to wait for a really long time to even be taken care of by a physician, receiving inadequate care. The problem itself that they went for is not being taken care of. They're not looked at as a person. Okay, this creates a sense of powerlessness, an alienation, a disconnect from the system. Okay, segregation and racism tend to be overt too, generally covert, but you will see these overt acts of racism. Okay, so the book says, in light of this situation, it's no wonder that some black people prefer to use time tested home remedies than be exposed to the humiliating experiences of hospitalization. And again, I talked about it when I said Native Americans are afraid of white doctors. And you have to ask, why are Native Americans afraid of white doctors? Then you start to delve into status and prejudice and discrimination. Okay? So again, poverty increases rates for everything. The book talks about lead poisoning because of, apartments, things like that, not being able to do genetic testing to test for sickle cell anemia because they don't have the insurance to cover the genetic test, for example. The book went deep, and the book starts talking about how white caretakers don't know how to take care of African Americans. And that was a powerful statement. And at first, it made me question a lot of things. But then the book started talking about skin and hair. And I had to ask myself, have I ever used a pick before? And again, how much does your culture that you're socialized into influence your knowledge, your skills, the way you think? Okay, and so it made me question a lot of things. Are white healthcare providers aware of non-white issues? Okay, but then it's vice versa. So again, we need to all be culturally dynamic and have a sense of where people are coming from. Okay, it's again to quote, the majority of the members of the healthcare profession are steeped in middle-class white value system. In clinical settings, providers are being helped to become familiar with and understand the value systems of other ethnic and socioeconomic groups. Hence the point of this class. Because culture is that of the dominant group. So if the dominant group is a white value system, is it representing the needs of other people, non-whites? Okay, so again, that's why we're taking this class. Thank you so much. Please email with any questions.